All right, good morning. We are going to be predominantly in Ezra 4 this morning. If you want to turn there, Ezra 4. Just a reminder of kind of where we are and the section we're in as far as how the writings of Ezra and Nehemiah are broken up. We're still in chapters 1 through 6, and these chapters predominantly feature the expedition led by Zerubbabel and others, but particularly Zerubbabel, back to the Promised Land, back to Jerusalem. And then the primary thing that's happening is they're rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. And so we're right in the midst of that in these chapters. We left off last time at the very end of chapter 3. And we looked at how, the people they've returned to Jerusalem. They're dwelling in their towns and cities and in Jerusalem. And they have built the altar, which is extremely significant. We talked about that. And then they've made preparations and they've laid the foundation for the temple. And so that kind of that first step in the temple building process, they've laid that foundation. And here's where we didn't get to last time, but I think this is an important set of verses in really the second half of verse 11. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted with a great shout, and the sound was heard far away. I think these are some very important verses because of the concept that's being portrayed here. You have older people in this group who they remember the previous temple from before the exile. They remember that, Solomon's temple. And now they've seen the foundation of this new temple laid. And here it doesn't necessarily specifically say what the issue is. But, if we look at the prophet Haggai, he says a few things that I think make this clear. The problem is they're looking at this new temple foundation. And the ones who remember the first temple, they're looking at this new foundation and thinking, this isn't as glorious. I mean, the foundation's laid, but it's not going to be a temple as big as Solomon's. It's just not. It's going to be less glorious than what we had before. And so you can see why that would cause them so much sorrow. And it's difficult for us to kind of identify with that because our hope really has nothing to do with physical things. And yet, from these people's perspective, no, it does, because God is going to dwell among us in a physical building, in a physical temple. And God, years before, had blessed our nation with all this treasure, all this prosperity. We had the best armies. We had the most glorious temple. We had all the gold. And nations would just marvel at what God had blessed us with. And so you can see why this older generation is upset, because, they trust in God, but God's promises that he's fulfilling just don't seem to be as good, as glorious as he indicated they would be. And I think that's something we can identify with. That what God has done for us and what God has said that is true of us, okay, but it doesn't always seem as good, as glorious as we think it's supposed to be. I mean, think about just the fact that, okay, we've been redeemed from death. We've been saved. We've been made the people of God. I mean, amazing. You can't even describe how amazing that is. And yet, we still suffer. And people that are not the people of God oppress us. And successfully destroy our lives. That doesn't really always feel like what God has said is true of us. And so what I want to point out is, constantly throughout the Bible, there's a tension here. There's tension between what God has promised and how he's fulfilled it so far versus what he's going to do. And the tension is caused by, okay, the person, whoever it is, in the scriptures or even us, is living in a situation where we have what God has promised, but not the ultimate of what God has promised. Which means there's still some negatives here that are causing tension between God's promises. And that negative that's causing the tension, we can intellectually realize that's not really thwarting God's promises at all. But it seems like it, and it feels like it. And so what that requires is to trust in God that, yes, it's not everything it's going to be yet. And yes, God has promised this much, and yet so far it's only this much. What that requires is a trust in God. And that's difficult. And I know that God recognizes, yes, that is difficult. But that's kind of where a lot of these people are here, is what Isaiah had said and what Jeremiah had said and what Ezekiel had said about when we return from captivity. This doesn't look like it. It does some, but not as great as we thought it was going to be. And so that's a challenge, and that's a challenge that I think a lot of us identify with. Any thoughts on that? Yes.
Spiritual matter the proper weight. My suspicion is for those who attain glory, if they look back, they'll think, what a marvelous promise, and we undervalued and misvalued the promise. It's just hard to grasp.
Oh, yeah. And that's what Haggai goes into. The prophet Haggai, he talks about that. Like, look, I know some of you think this new temple isn't as glorious, but God has said it will be. And so it's that. It's okay. Then it's trusting that future is going to be what God said it would be, despite the present difficulties and challenges of that. Yeah. Brother Mentor, do you have something?
Yes, I was going to say sometimes we don't make the full paradigm shift when we become Christians and realize that God is going to fulfill every promise that He gave us. That our God is nothing He withholds. It's us who doesn't fulfill His needs, what He wants, and we look to it through carnal eyes rather than realizing that God promises spiritual. for it in a physical way, we better realize our God is spiritual, and we are to be spiritual. And that's hard for man, as you pointed out, to have a concept of, because we deal in a physical world, and it's hard to turn and look at ourselves in a spiritual way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Good thoughts. Anything else? Yes, JD.
This might play into it a little bit, but I don't know if you ever built a house before, and you lay a foundation, and it looks like a joke. You're like, this is the smallest little piece of slab I've ever seen in my life. I paid this contract to do all these things, and it looks so small. A different perspective would be that, that foundations were in the proper dimensions. The first one, people couldn't see the finished product. They didn't have the faith to see what it was going to be like. God had promised that it would be that glorious.
Yeah. I mean, there's just a lot of reasons why, man, from their human perspective, their eyes like, God, this is not the fullness of what your prophets said would happen. And I think that is one of the challenges for them is, I mean, God told them, I'd bring you back to the land and you dwell with me again. And God even mentioned there being a temple again. So I think they naturally assume, well, it's going to be as glorious as Solomon's. I mean, why would it not be as glorious as Solomon's? You're telling me that God had this glorious temple of Solomon's, it was destroyed, and then he brings us back to the land to rebuild a smaller temple? I mean, you can see why, well, that doesn't make any sense. And so maybe even from their eyes, does that mean we're going to receive less glory because we sinned and went into captivity, and now the promises of God are less? You know, I mean, you can see why maybe some of these emotions are rattling through their heads. And it's challenging, especially for people that know the physical is part of their existence. I mean, God did give them a physical temple and the physical Ark of the Covenant. And yes, I mean, they had actual physical sacrifices they were offering on an altar. And yes, he gave them gold and silver. And that was part of the blessings that he promised them. So it's not that they didn't have a concept of greater, higher things, but God incorporated the physical into their worship and into their glory a lot. And so that would cause some challenges for them. I'm not seeing what I feel like it should look like. I'm actually seeing less. And what that should cause them to do is to just lean even harder on, we have to trust in God. He's going to make this as glorious as he claimed. And that's what the prophet Haggai is telling them. Is that God's saying, I will, just wait. My house will be more glorious than you can imagine. And so that's just, okay, then they have to faithfully wait for that and trust in that. Anything else about any of that? All right, so let's move into chapter 4. And I'm gonna read all of chapter 4, and then we'll come back and look at some specifics. Chapter 4, verse 1. Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of fathers' houses and said to them, let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of fathers' houses in Israel said to them, you have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build, and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purposes all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. And in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. In the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam and Mithridath and Tabeel and the rest of their associates wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. The letter was written in Aramaic and translated. Rehum the commander and Shimshai the scribe wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes the king as follows. Rehum the commander, Shimshai the scribe, and the rest of their associates, the judges, the governors, the officials, the Persians, the men of Erech, the Babylonians, the men of Susa, that is, the Elamites, and the rest of the nations, whom the great and noble Osnapor deported and settled in the cities of Samaria and in the rest of the province beyond the river. This is a copy of the letter that they sent. To Artaxerxes the king, your servants, the men of the province beyond the river, send greeting. And now be it known to the king that the Jews who came up from you to us have gone to Jerusalem. They are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now be it known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and the walls finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and the royal revenue will be impaired. Now, because we eat the salt of the palace, and it is not fitting for us to witness the king's dishonor, therefore we send and inform the king, in order that search may be made in the book of the records of your fathers. You will find in the book of the records and learn that this city is a rebellious city, hurtful to kings and provinces, and that sedition was stirred up in it from of old. That was why this city was laid waste. We make known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls finished, you will then have no possession in the province beyond the river. The king sent an answer to Rehum the commander and Shimshai the scribe and the rest of their associates who live in Samaria and in the rest of the province beyond the river, greeting. And now the letter that you sent to us has been plainly read before me. And I made a decree, and search has been made, and it has been found that this city from of old has risen against kings, and that rebellion and sedition have been made in it. And mighty kings have been over Jerusalem, who ruled over the whole province beyond the river, to whom tribute, custom, and toll were paid. Therefore, make a decree that these men be made to cease, and that this city be not rebuilt, until a decree is made by me. And take care not to be slack in this matter. Why should damage grow to the hurt of the king? Then when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum and Shimshai the scribe and their associates, they went in haste to the Jews at Jerusalem, and by force and power made them cease. Then the work on the house of God that is in Jerusalem stopped, and it ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. All right, there's a lot that we actually need to get through in this chapter. I hope we have time to do that. But let's start with this. The first three verses. It says, now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of fathers' houses and said to them, let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. So I'll just stop there and make this note. These people, and these other people, are people that, they're not in Jerusalem, but the surrounding lands, probably north of Jerusalem. And they say, we've been here a long time, and the reason we're here is the king of Assyria had exiled us here from our homelands. So, think about that. We know the Israelites got attacked and conquered and exiled away. Well, that happened to other people too. And so when the Assyrians were in power, they conquered other nations and exiled them to Canaan, to the Israelites' land. And so you've got people here, probably in the northern regions, where the northern kingdom of Israel was, probably there, they're living here because we got captured and we got exiled. And so we've been brought here, and this has been our land for a long, long time. So they're saying, we've been in this land, and keep in mind, the ancient pagan idea was every land has a designated god of that land. So they're thinking, we came to this land, and so the God of this land is the Lord, and so that's the God we worshiped. If we'd been exiled to Egypt, the Egyptian gods rule that land. We worship that God. But we're in this land, and so we've been sacrificing to your God. So they say, well, let us join you in this effort. Let us build with you. And so here's the response. But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of fathers' houses in Israel said to them, you have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. All right, so here's the question. Well, what is Zerubbabel's problem? And Jeshua and the rest of these leaders, their response, man, that's unchristian of them to say that. How could they say that to these people that come to them? Now, I don't actually mean any of that, but what are we supposed to make of that? Was that wrong of Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the rest of them to just refuse help from these people that come to them? I don't think it is wrong, but why not? Yeah. What do they have? Well, they say, we worship the same God as you. Yeah. 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 They say we worship the same God as you do. And on the surface, oh, okay, well, they worship the same God as us, so no problem. But yeah, when you really understand what the situation is, no, that statement's very misleading. That's not exactly true at all. And we'll get to that in a second. Yeah.
Well, we know right off that they're adversaries, and they probably
Yeah.
that they were brought there by this other king, and I guess we don't really know that they're Jews.
Right. Yeah. So there's a couple things there. But yeah, trust the narrator of the story, right? He just calls them adversaries. He didn't say, people came. Enemies, right? He just labels them as enemies right off the bat. So the narrator knows the situation. So he refers to them as adversaries. And then as we go through the chapter that we just read, we see that he's right. They are adversaries. Their reaction is antagonistic. They're seeking to harm the people. So these are not people that, we're just genuinely trying to help you, because of just a love for the Lord. That's not this at all. But that was their claim. And so getting back to what was just said, their claim, well, we've been sacrificing to your God ever since the days of the Assyrian king. That's technically probably true, that they do sacrifice to the Lord, and that the Lord is their God too, but not exclusively their God. In other words, the northern kingdom, for years and years and years and years and years and years and years, worshiped the Lord and other gods. And did not worship the Lord the way he had described. The northern kingdom is known for the 2 golden calves, and that was what they paid homage to and worship. So these people that have been brought in, who, either aren't Jews at all, or, if you go back and look at 2 Kings 17, foreigners are brought in, and they intermarry with the Israelites, and now you've got a mixed race. The Samaritans come from that. But so probably either they're a mixed race or not Jews at all, just foreigners in the land. They don't worship the Lord the way the Lord is supposed to be worshipped at all. The northern kingdom never had a good concept of how to worship the Lord, or they refused to worship him correctly. And even in 2 Kings 17, when it talks about some of these groups of people that are in the north, they worship the Lord, but also multiple gods. And so the statement, we sacrifice to the same God as you, that's true, but the difference is the Jews here with Zerubbabel sacrifice only to the Lord and no one else, whereas the adversaries sacrifice to the Lord and a bunch of other gods. And so you can see why, no, we're not on the same page at all. We do not have the same concept of our Lord. I mean, just in the fact that worshiping the Lord and only the Lord shows that you understand the Lord. Worshiping the Lord and other gods shows you have no idea who the Lord really is if you're worshiping other gods too. And so that's the situation here. So all that to say, this is not some honest, genuine love for the Lord that's motivating these people to want to help. That's not the case at all. And the narrator proves that as the story goes on. Any other thoughts on that? So you can see why there's a need to not include these people in what they're doing. Because the whole reason they went into exile is because we followed the example of the pagans, and we didn't worship the Lord only. You know, so you can see why they're like, we have no association with you in our religious efforts. And that's on purpose, because that's what got us in trouble in the first place. Well, now let's look at something that I know for some of you are like, oh no, it's a timeline and there's all this stuff. And I said several classes ago that it's a challenge to kind of learn the history and understand what happened. But when you do this, it enables you then to get so much more out of the story and see what's really happening here. So I've tried to just include on this screen the most basic elements, because I've seen timelines before that are so convoluted, there's no way anybody remembers what was on that screen. So hopefully that's not the case here. But this, all my slides are going to be on the website. So when you go to the Bible class on the website, you can download these. So if you want to look back over these, feel free to do so. But this is important. I want to go through who the Persian kings were during this whole period of Ezra and Nehemiah. Because the author of Ezra and Nehemiah assumes you already know who the kings are, and that's who he uses to tell when things happened. So we've already talked about Cyrus, and he made that decree in 539 to let all the exiles go home. After Cyrus, there's a couple guys that were kings, but they didn't really amount to anything. The next major ruler is Darius. Darius reigns, and then his son Ahasuerus, which in Ezra he's called Ahasuerus, but in the book of Esther he's called Xerxes. And so Ahasuerus or Xerxes, that's the king in the book of Esther, one of the chief characters in the book of Esther. And so the book of Esther takes place during his reign. And then his son is Artaxerxes. So keeping that order in mind is very helpful for understanding chapter 4 of Ezra, because the narrator just assumes you already know the order. In the same way that we might talk about our history and talk about what happened in the days of Washington or Lincoln or Kennedy, and we just assume that people know who was president when, what order. So these are the Persian kings that ruled during this time. And we're in the time of Zerubbabel, and so he would have returned around 538. And eventually, it's not that he died in 515, but eventually his work, everything that we have written about him, his work with the temple is done in 515. And it's during the time of Cyrus and then right into the beginning of the reign of Darius. And then years later, you have Ezra, and he returns with a group to the Promised Land. And that's in the time of Artaxerxes. So you see, we've skipped over. The book of Ezra skips over a lot of years. But Ezra returns in around 458, leads that group back. And then just a few years later, in 445, Nehemiah's group returns. And so Nehemiah leads his group back. And that's also in the days of Artaxerxes. All right, so that's just kind of the basic look at what's happening and around when it's happening. If you want the dates of the reigns of these kings, just let me know. I have those. I just wanted to include as little information as possible so we get the basic point. But I can email you a slide that has the dates of the reigns of the kings on there too if you want. So what our narrator in Ezra does now is he is going to kind of break from the story, break from what he's talking about in chapter 4, and instead of just continuing, during what happened in the days of Zerubbabel, he's going to break off and give a scope of all the opposition, or at least several examples of the opposition that happened throughout this time period. All right, so it's almost like he kind of pauses and says, okay, but also years later this happened, and then after that this happened, and then he's going to come back to what he was talking about in Zerubbabel's day. So let me show you that. So during this time, Cyrus, and then right toward the beginning of Darius, verses 4 and 5 say this: Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build, and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. All right, so those are verses 4 and 5. He says, look, this happened the rest of the days of Cyrus, into the reign of Darius. You had adversaries opposing the Jews and what they were doing. Then, in verse 6, he skips forward to something that happened during the reign of Ahasuerus, and how once again the adversaries tried to get the kings involved to stop the Jews. So it says, and in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Now, he doesn't tell us what all was involved there, but the Jews got falsely accused, and the enemies tried to get them in trouble with Ahasuerus. Years later, that happened. So more opposition was attempted there. Then the narrator skips to the reign of Artaxerxes, goes forward to that, and in verse 7, in the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam and Mithridath and Tabeel and the rest of their associates wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And once again, he didn't tell us what they said, but it's just another example of, our opponents also wrote something to Artaxerxes, trying to tell him something about what's going on here, trying to get him involved to stop what the Jews are doing. And then in verses 8 through 23, we get something else. Rehum the commander and Shimshai the scribe wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes the king as follows. And then we get that huge letter that we just read and the response from the king. But it's just important for us to understand that letter we just read that was sent to Artaxerxes and about what the Jews are doing and they're building and it's going to be horrible and you've got to stop them. And then the king's response, that's not happening in the time of Zerubbabel. The narrator is talking about what happened years later during the time of Artaxerxes. And he gives that story there because he's giving a scope of the constant opposition and the constant ways that political stuff has gotten in the way, or people tried to get the kings involved and tried to get them to stop and all this. And so that's verses 8 through 23. Then, and this is the key point that is so difficult for us to notice in our Bibles. Then the narrator is done with this scope, and he goes back to the time of Cyrus and Darius and Zerubbabel. But you don't notice that in our Bibles because you just kind of think he's just continuing chronologically one thing after another. But in verse 24, he's now going back to when Cyrus and Darius reigned, and he says this: Then the work on the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem stopped, and it ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. See, now he went back to that. And the reason this is important is because if you don't know he went back, then you assume he's going forward. And you'd assume, like, okay, well, Darius, king of Persia, did he come after Artaxerxes? And scholars love that because they'll say, the author of Ezra doesn't even know the order of the kings. What an idiot. And so we can't trust this book. I mean, that's what happens, is this book gets criticized because they think the author is just talking about these kings out of order. It doesn't even know what he's talking about. And he mentions Artaxerxes, and then he goes to Darius, who came after. That's ridiculous. This guy's not a good historian. We can't trust Ezra. The Bible's flawed, all that. So we need to understand what the author's doing so we can see, okay, he's not getting the kings out of order. He went through a scope of what happened and then went back to where he started. So in the same way that I may talk about the challenges that our country has faced and talk about this happened with President Washington. It was difficult. This happened. Something similar happened at the time of Lincoln. You see the same kind of thing happening at the time of Kennedy. You even saw, nowadays with President Trump, some of the same things. Anyway, so in Washington's day, I've gone back to Washington. And anybody that knows the order of the kings, the presidents, knows I've done that. Anybody that doesn't may think I'm talking about how there was a Washington after Trump. Like what? So it's not a huge deal. It doesn't really change, I think, any conclusions we draw from the book, but it is something that skeptics try and severely criticize and question the knowledge of the writer, which is just disproven anyway when you read through the book and you see that the author talks about the kings in order after this. So he knows the order of the Persian kings. All right, so with all that in mind, and if you have questions about that, feel free to ask me after class. With all that in mind, why give a history of the opposition? That's a huge question to ask for this. And there's several answers to this, I think. But one of the major things, I think, is so that we see that everything else we read through the rest of Ezra and Nehemiah is during a time of opposition. Everything else we read, there are politics involved. There are enemies involved. They are trying to get the kings to stop what the Jews are doing, which just sheds so much light on how powerful God is. That all this was accomplished anyway, despite what the kings are doing, despite what the adversaries are doing. And even when we're reading about what Ezra himself is going through, or what Nehemiah himself is going through, we already have in the background a knowledge that this is during opposition or attempts to oppose. And yet what we see instead is actually these kings are actually pretty helpful a lot of the time. And we'll read through that as we go through the writings, that these kings don't just cause tons of problems for the Jews. It's kind of the opposite. They actually assist sometimes. And they may get involved a little bit, but then they change their mind and help. And so it's just an amazing look at how God is not stopped by politics, period. And God's people should not be stopped by politics, period. And man, what an applicable lesson for us today. Despite what's happening with the adversaries and the kings, the people of God are committed to their work and should be committed to their work, trusting that these kings aren't the king. We serve the King of Kings, which means any lesser kings aren't really in charge, at least not above the king that ultimately reigns. So very important lesson for us. All right, any comments on that? All right, so on Wednesday, I'm actually really excited for Wednesday's class because we're going to look at this letter that was written to Artaxerxes, and it is a fascinating look at manipulation tactics and how the adversaries tried to manipulate the king. And I think in looking at it, it'll help us recognize manipulation. But that's what we're going to look at on Wednesday, and we'll try and finish chapter 4 and then move into chapter 5. So, all right, thank you very much. I appreciate it.